Hey guys, tonight we are heading way back to a time when the Nile wasn't just a river. It was the quiet pulse of an entire civilization. The air is already heavy with heat, even though the sun has only just started to push itself over the horizon. From your spot on a reed mat, you can see pale orange light catching on the tops of the papyrus plants swaying at the water's edge. Villagers are starting to stir, roosters making half-hearted crowing noises, and a few goats bleating like they'd prefer to be somewhere cooler. It's a day for brewing beer, not the fizzy bottled kind in your fridge, but the hearty, bready drink that fueled the ancient Egyptian morning. And yes, you're about to find out why you probably wouldn't survive this as your daily breakfast. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you do, I'd love it if you posted your location and local time in the comments, just so I know which corner of the world you're sipping this history from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're lying on a woven mat inside a mud brick home. Its walls cool from the night, but already warming as sunlight leaks through the doorway. The smell of yesterday's bread is faint in the air, mixing with the damp scent of river mud. Outside, a low murmur builds, people exchanging greetings, goats and donkeys clattering past, a child laughing as they chase a chicken that absolutely doesn't want to be caught. A group of women walk past your doorway balancing baskets on their heads, the sunlight picking out the frayed edges of the palm leaf weaving. You follow them into the village square where the brewing will begin. In the distance, you can already hear the slap of dough being kneaded and the gritty grind of stone on stone. Brewing beer here isn't just a once-in-a-while luxury, it's breakfast, lunch, and occasionally dinner. Historians still argue whether it was more about hydration than nutrition, since Nile water alone could be, let's say, adventurous on your stomach. The beer you'll help make today is thick and porridge-like, with enough calories to keep you going and just enough alcohol to make life seem pleasantly softened around the edges. The brewing crew moves like they've done this every morning of their lives, because they have. This is a rhythm passed down for generations. You notice how one person's job is only to tend the fires, squatting low to feed palm fronds into clay ovens. Another keeps watch over baskets of grain, shooing away bold little birds that seem to know the exact moment someone looks away. Off to your right, an old man sits weaving a new reed strainer for the beer, his hands working automatically as his eyes scan the busy square. It's a good day for brewing, he says, though you suspect every day is a good day for brewing to him. A small boy hands you a cup of yesterday's batch, still warm from the sun, smelling faintly of dates and earth. It's not exactly the crisp pint you might expect, but it's surprisingly comforting, like liquid bread. You take a cautious sip, and the slight tang makes your cheeks tighten for a second, before the sweetness spreads across your tongue. The Nile glints in the distance, its waters slow and deliberate. Soon, people will go down with clay jars to collect water for today's mash. The river is the quiet heartbeat of this place, and it's hard not to feel like you're breathing in time with it. Somewhere beyond the fields, you hear the call of an ibis. A pair of fishermen pull their narrow boat upriver, the sun catching on the copper hooks tied to their lines. You can imagine they'll trade part of their catch for beer later, one liquid currency for another. The morning moves unhurriedly. There's no rush. The beer will be ready when it's ready. You let yourself sink into that pace, the kind of slow rhythm modern life rarely allows. The air smells faintly sweet now, a promise of the brewing to come. The village hums around you, dogs stretching lazily in the shade, a woman shaking a reed basket to sift grain, the soft plunk of wet clay being shaped into new jars. It's here, in this gentle swirl of everyday life, that the day's brewing begins. Not with grand ceremony, but with the simple, steady work of hands that have done this for centuries. You realize you're about to learn every step from field to cup. And the sun, now higher over the Nile, paints the whole scene in warm gold, as if it knows the beer will match it perfectly in color. The wheat is ready. You can see it in the way the stalks bend ever so slightly under the weight of their ripened heads. They sway gently in the breeze, their gold made even richer by the slanting light of morning. The air here smells of sun-warmed earth and something faintly sweet-grained dust drifting in the wind. A small group is already at work, their bare feet sinking slightly into the soft soil, hands moving with a rhythm you quickly pick up on. Grasp, twist, pull, bundle. You join them, the warmth of the stalks brushing against your forearms as you reach down to pluck a handful. The sound is hushed but constant, dry fibers snapping, leaves rustling. A woman beside you hums a tune under her breath, the same note over and over, like she's keeping time for the whole field. This is emmer wheat, the heart of Egyptian bread and beer. Historians still argue whether this variety was chosen purely for its hardiness or because it happened to make a beer with just the right chewiness. Whatever the reason, it's been here for millennia, a constant in the shifting story of the Nile. You look up for a moment and take in the view beyond the shimmering gold of the wheat. The dark green ribbon of palm trees marks the river's path. Past that, the desert waits, its edges soft in the morning haze. The farmers here don't speak of the desert much. It's simply there, like the sky. It's the Nile that matters. Bundles of wheat are tied together with strips of papyrus fiber. The knot's quick and practiced. You carry one under your arm, feeling the scratch of chaff against your skin. The ground beneath you is warm now, each step releasing a puff of dust that catches in your throat. A man with a weathered face and a gap-toothed grin gestures toward a shady spot where others are piling the harvested bundles. He tells you, in a tone that's part instruction, part gentle tease, that this is the easy part. Later, there will be grinding, and your arms will remember it. While you work, a pair of ibises wander between the rows, their long beaks probing the soil for insects. Stirred up by the harvest, someone tosses them a few stray seeds, and they accept it like honored guests. You wonder if, in their own ibis way, they know they're part of the same morning routine that will end in beer. The sun climbs higher, the gold of the wheat deepening into amber. Occasionally, someone calls out when they find a particularly fat bundle, holding it up like a trophy. There's laughter, low and warm, and even a few groans when someone remembers the festival brewing coming up in 2 days. It'll mean twice the work. By the time your section of the field is clear, your hands are dusted with fine yellow powder. You brush them off, but the scent clings, earthy and a little nutty. The harvested bundles are ready for the next step, threshing. The emmer kernels are stubborn things, tightly wrapped in their husks, and coaxing them out is a process of both force and patience. In a corner of the field, a wooden frame strung with rope is being set up, a sort of oversized sieve. A pair of donkeys will be led around it, their hooves pressing and breaking the stalks. You'll help later, shaking the freed grain through the mesh to catch it in baskets. It's a strangely satisfying task, grain rattling against woven reeds. Like dry rain. The farmers speak of the harvest in terms of taste, not yield. This field, they say, makes a sweeter beer than the one upriver. That one, too bitter for their liking, is better suited for bread. It's a reminder that the brewing is not just sustenance but craft, shaped by the subtle differences in soil and sun. A boy no older than 8 runs past with a bundle twice his size, grinning like he's just stolen something valuable. His father pretends to chase him, and the rest of the workers chuckle, shaking their heads. The bundle will end up in the same pile as yours, destined for grinding, mixing, and the slow transformation into something that will steam in clay mugs by tomorrow. Morning. The work slows as the sun reaches its peak. People move toward the shade, some to rest, others to begin the next stage. You take a final look at the field. its golden stalks now reduced to short, stubbled rows, and feel a quiet satisfaction. There's something steadying about being part of a chain of hands that's been working these same rows for thousands of years. Somewhere, faint on the breeze, you catch the smell of baking bread from the village. It's a hint of what's coming next, but before that, the grain must be made ready. You follow the others back toward the sound of voices, your arms brushing against bundles as you walk, the harvest rustling softly like a secret being kept. Asterisk. The harvested bundles are stacked in neat, leaning piles near the edge of the village. Their straw tips sway slightly in the warm breeze, and a few stray kernels glint in the sunlight where they've escaped. The air here is different from the fields, less wild, more focused, because this is where the real transformation begins. You kneel beside one of the larger baskets of grain, running your fingers through it. The kernels are rough, they're outer, husks clinging stubbornly. Even before you start, you can feel the work in your forearms. Two women sit cross-legged nearby, each with a handstone in front of them, their upper bodies swaying gently as they grind. The sound, stone against stone, is steady and soothing, like a slow heartbeat. You're handed your own handstone, heavier than you expected. It's smooth in the center from years of use, the edges chipped in little crescents from the pressure of countless palms. The lower stone, the quern, sits on the ground, sprinkled with kernels. You tip the upper stone forward and back, pressing the grain into coarse flour. It's not the fine powder you'd expect from modern baking. It's gritty, dotted with flecks of husk. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians left some of the husk in deliberately for texture, or simply because removing it completely was too much trouble. Either way, your arms are already telling you they're not built for a morning of this. The movement works your shoulders, your wrists, even the muscles in your back. A boy passes by with a jug of yesterday's beer, pouring a splash into a clay cup for one of the grinders. You accept the sip yourself, warm, faintly sweet, and surprisingly refreshing despite the heat. There's a camaraderie here, a shared understanding that the beer fuels the work that makes more beer. Nearby, another group is sifting grain through wide reed baskets, shaking them rhythmically so the lighter chaff floats off in little clouds. The sun catches those drifting particles, making them shimmer like tiny golden gnats. Every so often, a gust of wind carries them farther, and someone laughs, calling out that the gods are stealing their breakfast. You notice a cat weaving through the legs of the workers, eyes sharp for any grain that might drop. Cats here aren't just pets, they're guardians of the food stores, and they know their worth. One settles beside you, curling its tail neatly around its paws, watching you work as if evaluating your technique. After what feels like hours, but is probably less than one you've ground enough for a small batch. The flour is collected into a basket lined with linen, the fabric stained from years of holding grain. You stand, stretching your back, feeling the ache set in like a badge of authenticity dot across the work area. An older man with skin like creased leather is sharpening a chisel. He's a millwright of sorts, responsible for repairing the larger grinding stones used in the temple bakeries. He tells you, with a wry smile, that a poorly kept stone will ruin the flavor of the beer. You're not entirely sure if he's teasing, but you nod solemnly just in case. There's a rhythm to this space, a slow cycle of grinding, sifting, collecting. People come and go, dropping off fresh grain, carrying away filled baskets. Even the pauses are unhurried. Someone stops to swat at a fly, to share a quiet joke, to glance toward the river. By midday, the ground grain is stacked in neat linen-wrapped bundles, ready to be carried to the next stage. The scent here is rich and earthy, the kind of smell that makes you think of warmth, even when you're already hot. As you walk away with your basket, the cat follows for a few steps before deciding it has better things to do. The steady scrape of grinding stones fades behind you, replaced by the muffled thud of dough being kneaded somewhere ahead. You can almost taste the next step, doughy, yeasty, and already halfway to becoming beer. The thought makes you smile. The work is hard. Yes, but there's something deeply comforting in knowing exactly where each step will lead. You're not just moving grain, you're moving toward a shared meal, a shared morning, a shared history. And just over there, you see the bakers waiting, their hands dusted white, their eyes scanning the path for the next delivery. You're bringing them the day's foundation, and they're ready to turn it into something extraordinary. Asterisk. You set your basket down beside the baker's, and a soft cloud of flour dusts the air between you. The smell here is different, warmer, tangier, thanks to the small piles of yesterday's dough resting under cloths, fermenting gently in the heat. This is where the ground grain becomes something living. One of the baker's gestures for you to join in, pressing a wide clay bowl into your hands. It's already half filled with the coarse emmer flour you helped grind. He pours in water from a tall jar, the stream catching the light as it splashes into the bowl. The mixture darkens, clumps forming immediately. You plunge your hands into it, the cool stickiness oozing between your fingers. The baker smiles knowingly. This is the point where most first-timers either get hooked or decide bread making is not for them. You press and fold, feeling the texture change slowly as the water soaks in. A woman across from you is working her dough with practiced strength, kneading in long, sure motions that make your own efforts look like hesitant pokes. She's humming a tune different from the one in the fields earlier, but just as steady. You start to catch the rhythm and match your kneading to it. Once the dough is smooth enough to hold its shape, the baker hands you a small handful of crushed dates. Their syrupy sweetness clings to your fingertips as you scatter them into the mix. Historians still argue whether dates were added for flavor, preservation, or simply because they were plentiful along the Nile. Whatever the reason, the sticky sweetness melts into the dough, hinting at the beer's eventual richness. A second bowl is brought to you, this one with a hint of spice ground coriander and a pinch of something that smells faintly like cinnamon bark. You lean in and breathe it in deeply. The spices are subtle, meant to whisper through the beer rather than shout. The dough is divided into portions and shaped into squat, dense loaves more like thick discs than the tall bread you might picture. You pat them into shape, dusting off your palms occasionally to keep them from sticking. Beside you, a boy is pressing his loaves into a shallow mold carved with a lotus pattern. The design will bake right into the bread, a small mark of care that will dissolve later in the beer. The bakers work without hurry. They pause to stretch, to sip from small cups of last week's brew, to chat about the weather and the coming flood season. You catch pieces of their conversation, something about how the beer will taste different if the grain grows in the shadow of the hills, something about how this year's river water seems sweeter. Before long, the low table is covered with neat rows of dough, ready for baking. You can feel the shift in the space. This stage is done, and the next is about to begin. The bakers brush off their hands, dust rising in pale clouds that shimmer briefly before settling. You carry your loaves carefully toward the ovens, feeling their slight warmth through the dough. It's strange to think these unassuming lumps will be the base for a drink, one that people here depend on as much as bread itself. The connection between the two is literal. The bread feeds the beer. The beer feeds the people. As you step closer to the ovens, the air grows hotter, tinged with the scent of charred wood and clay. Someone fans the flames with a bundle of palm fronds, coaxing the fire into a steady roar. The oven mouths glow faintly red inside, promising a transformation you can almost taste. You set your loaves on a tray of woven reeds, ready to hand them over. The baker gives you an approving nod, and for a moment you feel like you've been accepted into a quiet, ancient club, one that measures time not in hours, but in batches of bread. Behind you, the rest of the village hums with life. Children chase each other around the stacks of grain. Goats nose at discarded husks. And somewhere down by the river, you hear the slap of wet laundry on flat stones. The world is wide, but in this moment, All that matters is the warm, sticky dough in your hands and the promise of the beer it will become. Asterisk, you pass the tray of squat loaves to the baker, and the heat from the clay ovens licks your face like a friendly jackal, curious, a little bold, not actually trying to bite. The oven mouths are low domes of fired clay, each one breathing its own small weather system, red at the heart, orange at the rim. Someone slides a reed fan across the opening, and the flame flares brighter, painting the baker's forearms the color of sunrise. Your loaves wait on the reed tray, patient as turtles. He gestures, and you lean in. With a practiced flick, he tucks the first round deep inside on a flat shard of fired clay. It lands with a papery shuff, and the surface begins to tighten. Almost immediately. If bread had a heartbeat, this would be it. A gentle, steady puffing as steam tries to escape. The smell shifts from raw flour to something warm and promising. You think of the grindstone scrape from earlier and feel a private little victory for your shoulders. A cat appears, as they do, strolling along the oven ledge with the self-appointed rank of supervisor. It sits, tail wrapped elegantly, eyes narrowed against the heat. The baker doesn't mind cats earn their seat at the table here, guardians of grain from mice and other nibblers. The cat pretends not to care about your bread, which means it absolutely does. The first loaf balloons. Slightly, then fissures. Tiny cracks map themselves like dried riverbeds across the surface, a topography of heat. You watch one crack widen and exhale a thread of steam that smells faintly of dates and coriander from the dough. Somewhere behind you a child claps at. The sound of a bubble popping at the way the bread seems to breathe. You find yourself clapping quietly too, and the baker gives a quick grin that says you're not the first to applaud a loaf. Mainstream fact time. Slipped in as gently as a loaf on a peel. In many Egyptian scenes painted on tomb walls, bakers work shoulder to shoulder with brewers, because beer and bread are twins born of the same grain, sharing the same yeast-riddled breath. What you're watching is the step that makes the beer possible. These are not tender dinner rolls to slice with honey. They are beer bread, baked enough to set the starches, porous enough to surrender to hot water, and perfumed enough to tempt you to sneak a nibble. You don't. Much. Asterisk, the second oven opens. Inside, the glow is steady, fed with splinters of palm wood and dried reeds. The fire tender, whose entire job seems to be talk to the flames like they're stubborn. Donkeys adds a twist of fuel, listens, adds a little more. He claims he can tell temperature by the note the fire makes when he taps the oven wall. Historians still argue whether that's a real skill or just something fire tenders say to keep the mystique alive. But you hear the difference too. A higher, tighter ring on the hot sections, a duller thud where the clay is cooler. You notice some loaves go to the very back, others stay nearer the mouth. The baker explains with a shrug that different spots give different textures. The back crisps and chars fast. The near space keeps a softer crumb. For brewing, you want to mix some loaves to crumble easily, others to lend body. He says this the way you might say, some mornings need strong coffee, some need oatmeal. You nod like you've always known this. Asterisk, every few minutes, a loaf is teased forward with a curved stick, flipped, pushed back. A few bubble extravagantly and split in a way that would break a modern baker's heart, but delights. This one more fissures mean more surface for the mash to explore later. A dragonfly zips through the heat, shimmer like an impatient customer. Someone jokes that it's here for the fly-through service, which is, you admit, exactly the sort of humor a field of ovens inspires. Asterisk, quirky tidbit. One baker taps each finished loaf with a carved pebble stamp. Just a dot and line pattern that will vanish in the mash, but he insists it helps him count batches, and also that the beer tastes better when the loaves are blessed by the dot. The others roll their eyes with affectionate theatrics. You resolve to believe in the dot too. Why not cultivate friendly superstitions when the day runs on them? Another batch goes in, and the ovens become a chorus. You hear the soft crackle of crust, the sigh of steam, the conversational mutter of fire. A reed basket is laid with finished rounds to cool. Their surface is matte and pale, except for freckles of char. You touch one lightly. The crust clicks under your fingertip. Heat sits inside it like a secret. A woman brings a small jar of natrona, naturally occurring salt they use for cleaning, for rituals, for everything that pretends to be magic and is actually chemistry. She sprinkles a pinch on a few loaves destined for temple offerings. For purity, she says, then winks, and for taste. Historians still argue whether natron ever flavored everyday breads or stayed strictly ceremonial. But your tongue votes yes for the little tang it promises. Asterisk. The sky lowers with heat. The village sounds dim under the oven's hush. You notice how the baker's hands move with identical economy. Flatten, place, turn, tease, tap, each motion wasting nothing, respecting the fuel, respecting time. They will make dozens, then scores of these rounds, enough to feed a whole morning's brew and a little more for neighbors who trade fish, onions, or an extra clay jar. The trade is never noisy. People pass, nod, leave small bundles, carry off. Worn disc-like suns in reed slings. A butter-yellow dog sprawls in the shade, dreaming the complicated dreams of dogs who have smelled all the smells. Twice, it thumps its tail at the sound of bubbling crust, which you consider excellent taste in soundtracks. Your third quiet joke of the hour is to tell it that the crust isn't calling its name yet. The dog snores in polite disagreement. You're offered a taste from a loaf that baked a little longer than intended, a casualty of a lively conversation. The char is smoky but not bitter, and the crumb inside is astonishingly soft, almost custardy from the date sugars. You break off a thumb-sized bite and it melts into warmth on your tongue. The baker nods like a teacher when a student finally stops overthinking and just tastes the answer. Asterisk. Another mainstream marker slips in, almost shy. Egyptians often baked bread in conical molds set around or inside ovens, and for beer bread, they favored shapes and textures that crumbled easily into hot water. You notice a rack of conical forms by the wall, soot-kissed and glossy from use. Some loaves today go into those molds, producing tender wedges with crisp ridges that will catch yeast later like tiny stair-steps. The afternoon lengthens. Shadows pool in the cracks between bricks. A breeze noses through the workyard, carrying a hint of river cool, and the ovens exhale it back as warmth. Someone brings a jug of yesterday's beer in tiny cups. You sip, and the flavor tastes already of what you're baking now, as if the future loaf reached back to shake hands with the present mug. It's bready, soft, mildly sweet, and the faintest bit tart, pleasantly so. The way a green apple wakes your mouth without scolding it. The baker stacks the last cooling rounds and gestures toward the brewery courtyard, where wide-mouthed jars wait in neat ranks like hippos in a calm lagoon. These loaves will soon surrender themselves to hot water, crumble under wooden paddles, and cloud the jars with starch and sweetness. The crackles you heard in the oven will become bubbles in the mash. The maps of fissures will become pathways for yeast. The blessing well that will become a good story to tell while you stir. Asterisk. You lift the reed tray and feel its comfortable weight. Not heavy, not light, just definite, like responsibility you chose. On the rim of the tray, a dusting of flour gathers in triangles where your thumbs rest. The ovens behind you keep breathing to themselves, content and tireless, as if they'll continue all night whether you watch or not. You share one last look with the cat supervisor. It blinks slowly, a sign of deep approval, or possibly of falling asleep on duty. Either way, you take it as license to proceed. The path to the jars is packed earth and familiar footprints. The crackle fades behind you. The promise ahead thickens, warm and sweet as a whispered yawn. You set the reed tray down beside a low table. and the loaves still faintly warm rest. They're like little suns that have decided to cool off for the evening. The next task is strangely satisfying, almost childlike in its simplicity, breaking them apart. A wide clay basin sits in front of you, and its inside surface is patterned with scratches from years of bread crumbling. You pick up the first loaf, its crust crackling softly under your grip, and push your thumbs into the center. The bread gives way with a hushed sigh, breaking into rough, uneven chunks. The baker beside you works faster, snapping loaves in half with a twist of the wrist, then crumbling the pieces between his fingers until they're no bigger than walnuts. He explains not with urgency, but with that patient tone of someone who's told this story many times, that the chunks must be just right. Too large and the hot water won't draw out enough starch. Too small and you'll get a paste that clogs the jars. Historians still argue whether this precision was born from trial and error, or whether there was an unspoken brewing math passed down like a family recipe. The sound of crumbling bread is oddly pleasant, a dry, sandy whisper punctuated by the occasional sharp snap of crust. The aroma is even better, warm grain, date sweetness, and the faintest breath of smoke from the oven's char. Your fingertips pick up a fine dust of flour and spice that clings no matter how often you rub them together. Children wander by, curious, dipping a finger into the bread dust and licking it like some secret treat. The baker pretends to scold them, but you notice he leaves the crumb bowl conveniently close to their reach. One bold boy even takes a chunk and pretends to toss it into his mouth before slipping it into his pocket, perhaps for later trading one bread nugget for a fig or a story. Each loaf you crumble reveals a different personality. Some are pale and airy inside, light enough to almost float. Others are dense and chewy, their sweetness darker, richer, thanks to more dates or a hotter bake. The variety will make the beer layered in flavor, something the village seems to instinctively value even if they never talk about it. In a corner, an older woman with arms like woven rope works steadily at her own basin. She hums a tune you think you've heard before, maybe from the fields, and pauses now and then to tap her bread chunks with a wooden spoon, testing for the right firmness. She claims she can tell if the beer will ferment well just from the sound of the crumbling. You're not sure you believe her, but the others nod as if it's common knowledge. Quirky tidbit: some bakers set aside a loaf or two to dry completely in the sun before crumbling. These sun-baked chunks, hard as stones, are dropped whole into the mash to release flavor slowly over days. They call them sleeping bread because they wake during fermentation. One of the boys brings you a piece to feel. It's so solid you could use it as a doorstop. The pile of bread chunks in your basin grows steadily. Every so often, you shake the basin gently, letting the smaller crumbs fall to the bottom while the larger pieces rise to the top. This way, when you scoop the chunks into the jars later, you can control the mix: more coarse for body, more fine for quick sweetness. A breeze drifts in from the Nile, carrying the scent of wet reeds and distant fish smoke from the fishermen's morning haul. The contrast between that damp river smell and the dry warmth of the bread makes you strangely aware of the coming step. Water. Cool, flowing, alive water meeting the crumbly, baked heart of the grain dock. By the time the sun leans westward, the table is crowded with basins of crumbled bread, each one a mix of pale gold and soft brown. The bakers begin loading them into wide baskets lined with linen, tying the cloth into loose bundles for easy carrying. You lift one, surprised again by the weight. Grain is humble until you try to move it in bulk. Man with a low laugh and a slightly crooked walk gestures for you to follow him toward the river. Time for the Nile's part in all this, he says, as if the river is an old co-worker you're finally meeting. And as the path slopes gently toward the glittering water, the air shifts again, cooler, fresher, touched with that familiar, ancient scent of silt and life. Behind you, the bread breaking continues without pause. The soft snap and crumble fades. Into the distance, replaced by the low rush of water against the riverbank. You know the bread will wait patiently for your return, ready for the moment when the Nile completes its partnership in the brew. The Nile lies before you, wide and deliberate, its surface catching the afternoon light in slow-moving shards of silver. Reeds fringe the edges in feathery clusters, swaying gently, their roots sunk deep in silt so dark it could swallow your hand. The air here is cooler, touched with the faint, earthy tang of river mud and the sharp green of wet plants. Somewhere nearby, a water bird lets out a questioning cry, as if you've interrupted its private thoughts. Beside you, the man with the crooked walk sets down his basket of crumbled bread and gestures toward a row of clay jars standing in the shallows. They're weighted with smooth river stone so they don't tip, each one already filling slowly as water seeps in through a cloth stretched over the mouth. Keeps the fish out, he says, though you can see a few tiny ones darting in the shallows as if they'd like to make a case for themselves. You crouch and dip your hands into the Nile. The water is surprisingly cool despite the heat of the day. It slides over your skin in silky currents, leaving behind a fine grit that clings until you rub it away. The man laughs softly. It's not clean like your modern fountains, he says, though he doesn't know what a fountain is. But the beer doesn't mind. Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptians boiled their brewing water or relied entirely on fermentation to make it safe. Here, you see no boiling, just careful filtering through linen and the addition of enough yeast to outcompete whatever else might be lurking. The faith in the process is unshakable, born of thousands of mornings like this. Nearby, a group of women are working with broad, shallow baskets, scooping water and letting it drain slowly through reeds packed into the bottom. The reeds catch larger debris bits of leaf, stray insect husks, while the water trickles through, clear enough for the next stage. You're handed one of these baskets and told to listen to the water. At first, you think they're joking, but as you tilt the basket just right, you hear it. A soft, irregular patter as the water finds its way through the reeds. Too fast means you're spilling. Too slow means you've packed them too tightly. A boy runs past, holding up a wriggling fish he's caught with his bare hands. Someone calls out to return it to the river better, to keep the brewing jars free of extra ingredients. He obeys with a theatrical sigh, releasing it with a splash that makes the water glitter in the sun. You're given a jug made of fired clay, its neck narrow, its surface cool to the touch. Dunking it into the river feels like the oldest motion in the world. You lift it, watching droplets slide down its side, leaving little comet trails in the dust clinging to the surface. The first sip you take is purely curiosity. It's sweet in a mineral sort of way, with a faint cloudiness that says it's very much alive. Quirky tidbit: some brewers swear that water taken from the river just before sunrise makes the smoothest beer. They call it first light water and claim it carries a gentler spirit. Today, though, the sun is already dipping, and your water will have the bolder, more robust taste of the afternoon. Whether that's real or just poetic preference, nobody can say. The filled jugs are set in the shade, their mouths covered with linen held in place by twine. A fine dusting of silt settles on the cloth almost immediately, proof that the filtering is not yet perfect. You'll pour it again through a cleaner layer just before it meets the bread. Looking upriver, you see a fisherman poling his skiff along the bank. His net trails behind like a lazy shadow, glinting every time it catches the sun. He lifts a hand in greeting, and you realize he's humming, not unlike the bakers, not unlike the harvesters. It's the same slow rhythm, the same unhurried melody that seems to thread through the entire day here. When the last jar is full, the man with the crooked walk dips a hand into one and lets the water spill slowly through his fingers. Good. Enough, he says, though you suspect it's more instinct than measurement. You take your basket of water jars, feeling their cool weight pull gently against your arm's dot as you walk back toward the village. The Nile's murmuring fade into the background, replaced by the dry shuffle of your sandals on the packed earth path. The sun's angle has shifted, stretching your shadow long and thin ahead of you. The bread you crumbled earlier is waiting, and soon the two will meet solid and liquid, grain and river ready to begin the quiet transformation that has kept this place alive for thousands of years. And somewhere behind you, the Nile keeps flowing, indifferent to your small part in its story, but carrying it forward all the same. The village air feels heavier now, baked through by the late afternoon sun. And yet when you step into the brewery courtyard, the scent here is almost cooling, earthy, bread mingling with the faintly sweet mineral breath of the Nile water you've just carried. The basins of crumbled loaves are still waiting, their surfaces catching the light like little landscapes of hills and valleys. Beside them, the jars of river water sit under their linen veils, dark and still. The head brewer, a man with shoulders like the doorframe of a temple, waves you over. He doesn't say much, just points to a wide, low-mouthed vat made of clay, its rim worn smooth by countless hands. You untie one of the linen bundles and tip the bread into it. The chunks tumble in with soft thuds, releasing another wave of that date and spice scent. Now comes the meeting of bread and water. The brewer takes one of your jars, pulls away the linen, and pours slowly, letting the cool stream splash against the bread. Steam doesn't rise. This isn't boiling water, but the air does shift, thickening with a new aroma, softened grain, faintly fruity, like the start of porridge. You're handed a paddle carved from tamarisk wood, its surface polished from years of stirring, and you begin to press the bread down, coaxing it to drink in the water. The motion is slow and circular, pressing, turning, lifting. Chunks break apart under the paddle, releasing tiny bubbles that rise and pop at the surface. You lean closer and catch a soft, damp whisper, the bread sighing into the water as it surrenders its starch. The vat grows heavier, the liquid cloudier, until it looks less like water and more like a pale, frothy soup. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians used this cold mash method exclusively, or whether they sometimes heated the mixture to quicken the process. Here, at least today, no fire touches it, only patience. The brewer claims heating it would scare the gods out of it, which is either a metaphor or a superstition he enjoys repeating to strangers. Others join you, each with a paddle, and the vat becomes a gentle chorus of wooden swirls. The sound is hypnotic, scrape, swish, bubble blending with the occasional thud when someone's paddle meets a stubborn loaf. A woman on your left hums while she stirs. Not the field tune you've heard before, but something lower, almost a lullaby, quirky tidbit. As the bread soaks, a few people take turns sprinkling in mashed dates, sometimes along with a pinch of aromatic seeds like fenugreek or caraway. These extras aren't for every batch. Some are plain, meant for wages or temple offerings, but for today's village beer, they add a quiet complexity. You help by crushing a few dates between your fingers, their syrup sticking to your palms until you rinse them in the cloudy mash. Every so often, the brewer dips a hand into the vat, closes his fist around a handful of the soaking bread, and lets the liquid run out between his fingers. He seems to be testing the softness, though he never says exactly what he's looking for. You try the same and find it oddly calming, like squeezing river clay. By now, the courtyard smells like a feast without a single plate in sight. Warm bread, sweet fruit, and the faint sharpness of green herbs. The air hums with quiet conversation, someone mentioning the coming flood, someone else teasing about who will spill their paddle into the vat first. When the mash reaches the right consistency, thick but pourable, it's scooped into smaller clay jars, each one no taller than your knee. The jars are arranged in rows along a shaded wall, their mouths left open for now. You help lift them, feeling the slosh inside. Each jar a little world in progress. A boy darts past carrying a reed mat, which he lays over the jars to keep out dust and insects. The brewer checks the alignment, straight rows, evenly spaced as though the yeast will appreciate the orderliness. Maybe it will. The sun is dipping now, laying long golden lines across the courtyard. The bread has given itself fully to the water, and soon the yeast will arrive, both invited and inevitable, to begin its unseen work. The jars sit quietly, holding that soft, bready cloud, and you can almost imagine you hear the first faint stirrings inside, though you know it's only your own heartbeat slowing to match the day's pace. The brewer leans on his paddle and looks at you with a faint smile. "Tomorrow," he says, as if that one word contains the entire secret of brewing. And maybe, here on the banks of the Nile, it does. You return the next morning to find the courtyard quieter than you expected, though the air feels somehow thicker, as if holding its breath. The clay jars stand exactly where you left them, but the surface of the mash inside is no longer still. Small, lazy bubbles rise and burst with soft little blips, releasing faint wisps of aroma into the warm air, sour and sweet at once. Like warm bread left in the sun. You lean over one jar and breathe in. The scent is alive, now still carrying the date and grain you remember, but threaded through with that unmistakable tang of fermentation. It prickles faintly at your nose, like a friendly warning that something here has begun to change in ways you can't quite see. The brewer appears from the shadows, already chewing a piece of bread as though breakfast happens in passing. Without a word, he hands you a wooden paddle and nods toward the nearest jar. "Listen to it," he says. You stir slowly, feeling the paddle meet soft resistance as it moves through the clouded liquid. The faint fizz grows louder in the clay echo chamber, like faraway rain on a mud roof. Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptians relied solely on wild airborne yeast for this stage, or whether they kept a starter from previous batches. Here, the brewer explains, both are true. Each jar carries a bit of yesterday's foam in its mix, but the air, thick with bakery and brewery scents, offers its own invisible guests. The gods send them, he adds, though you suspect the gods simply appreciate the smell. Others arrive, each lifting a jar to peer inside, sniff, stir, or skim the foam that forms at the edges. You're shown how to tilt the jar slightly and use a reed strainer to remove larger husk fragments that have floated up. The strainer feels rough in your hand, the reeds worn soft but still springy. You press it gently against the side of the jar, coaxing the foam into a separate bowl. Quirky tidbit: some of this foam is considered a delicacy spread on flatbread or stirred into porridge for a tangy kick. A young girl brings a small dish of it to her grandfather, who eats it with the slow, satisfied air of someone enjoying both the taste and the memory it carries. You stir again, and this time you hear the mash answer back more insistently, a wet fizz that makes you think of tiny voices rising all at once. The surface shimmers faintly, and you notice the line of sediment at the bottom has begun to shift, lifting slightly with each bubble. It's not dramatic, but it's constant. Brewer leans over one jar and dips his hand in, not to taste, but to feel the temperature. "Warm enough," he says. Warmth matters. It keeps the yeast active, though here, the Egyptian sun is both the thermostat and the fuel bill. You realize that time moves differently here. The yeast works as it pleases, unhurried but relentless, and the people match its rhythm. A man sharpens a knife in the corner. Someone else oils the hinges of a storage chest. Children chase each other past the rows of jars, careful not to knock them. Life folds around the brewing like a backdrop, neither ignoring it nor staring at it too closely. A pair of women carry in more jars, smaller ones that will hold finished beer. They set them upside down in the sun to dry completely before use any. Lingering moisture might invite unwanted flavors. You run your hand over the clay. It's warm, almost too warm to hold for long. The day drifts. Every hour or so, you're called back to stir again, to watch the bubbles and skim a little more. Foam. You notice how the smell deepens, not stronger exactly, but more layered, with a faint hint of green from the herbs mixed into the bread. The brewer explains that the bubbles will grow smaller over time, and when they fade almost to nothing, the beer will be ready. By late afternoon, the courtyard hums with low, contented talk. Someone has brought a basket of figs, and they're passed around between turns at the paddles. The beer bubbles on, oblivious to your fig-sticky fingers. As the sun leans low, the brewer takes a final slow stir for the day, pats the jar's rim, like you might pat a sleeping dog, and drapes a fresh cloth over the opening. Tomorrow, he says again. But now you understand that the word doesn't just mean time, it means trust in the slow, unseen work happening here. You step back, letting the jars settle into their quiet chorus of fizz and sighs, their breath rising like a soft hymn into the cooling air. Asterisk. Morning returns with the sound of bubbles whispering themselves out of existence. You stand among the neat ranks of jars and watch as the froth that once looked lively and mischievous settles into a calmer, creamier cap. Today is a day for patience with a purpose, skinning and straining, the quiet choreography that turns a friendly swamp into something you can actually sip without needing a husk mid-swallow. You take up a reed strainer, the kind woven tight in the middle and looser at the rim, its edge bound with a thin twist of papyrus. It's warm from the sun and smells faintly of river grass. The brewer nods toward a jar, and you tilt the strainer across the surface, drawing it slowly from one side to the other. The foam folds over itself, collects against the reeds, and leaves behind a smoother, more confident surface. The sound is soft, like a brush across canvas. You learn quickly not to plunge. This is skimming, not wrestling. Under the foam, the mash looks like a pale, cloudy sunrise. You can see small flex-grained skins, spice specks, the occasional obstinate crumb just suspended there, considering their options. The brewer shows you a rhythm. Skim, pause, skim again. Then lift the strainer and let the clinging froth slide into a bowl lined with linen. That linen is your next companion. You'll pour the liquid through it later, but for now it catches foam like a patient fisherman. Asterisk mainstream fact. Gently ladled. Egyptian brewers used a variety of strainers, woven reeds, perforated ceramic, funnels, and layered linens to clarify their beer. A practice you can spot in tomb paintings where attendants pour from jar to jar, through something that looks suspiciously like a cloth nest. You glance at your linen nest and feel art historically validated. Skimming is only the first step. Once the jars are lightly defrothified, a technical term you're inventing with local approval, you begin the transfer. Two people lift a jar and tip it slowly into a wide-bellied pot lined with clean linen. The cloth sags under the weight of the liquid, and the first trickle runs through, pale gold and slightly opaque. You hold the corners of the cloth, hands steady, letting the liquid decide its pace. When the flow slows, you gather the linen like a bag and twist, coaxing more beer out while the solids huddle inside like well-behaved crumbs. Historians still argue whether these linens were always bleached with natron for purity or whether everyday brewing relied on whatever clean cloth was at hand. The head brewer shrugs at the question and waves a jar of natron like a condiment useful, yes, but hardly sacred. Your nose votes for fresh cloth plus sun, which seems to be the local consensus for most problems. The courtyard becomes a workshop of gentle pouring. A pair of women handle a perforated ceramic funnel, its base speckled with thumb-sized holes nestled into a receiving jar. They pour the linen-clarified beer through the funnel, and the last floating husks get politely stopped at the threshold. The funnel is older than anyone here. Its rim is smooth as river pebbles. You run a finger along it and feel the cool of fired clay holding the memory of 1,000 batches. Asterisk. Quirky tidbit. One brewer swears by adding a few strips of clean papyrus into the cloth as he filters. It tickles the beer, he says, which is either a metaphor for oration or a commitment to whimsy. You try it on one jar and the filtered stream does look livelier, a little brighter in the sun. At minimum, the beer seems amused. The foam bowl fills. Remember that tangy topper you saw yesterday? Some of it gets whisked away to the kitchen for today's porridge, and some gets reserved as starter for the next brew, a foamy nudge to tomorrow. You wonder how many mornings in a row this chain has held, each day's breath lending a hand to the next. The thought makes you oddly sentimental about yeast tiny workers with no time off and absolutely no union. A cat the same dignitary, who supervised the oven steps onto the wall and watches your technique with slow blinks. You assure it that no fish are being filtered, only grain, and that the foam is not a cat snack. It sits anyway, making the face that could be translated as, "I will accept tribute in sunbeams." You move to the next stage, settling and decanting. After the first pass through linen, the beer rests in a broad pan so the heavier flecks can drift down and make themselves comfortable. You lean over and watch them fall, patient as snow in muddy water. When the top looks clearer, never glass clear, but serenely hazy, you tip the pan's edge and pour the upper layer into narrow-necked jars. The last finger's width stays behind with the sediment. Throwing that bit out feels wasteful until you remember tomorrow's pigs and poultry benefit from brewerly generosity. Nothing in this village walks away unappreciated, not even spent grain. A neighbor from the temple arrives, inspecting a few jars destined for offerings. He sniffs, nods, then checks the rims for the tiny dot imprint, the baker's blessing by the dot. You stifle a smile. The dot has become a character in your day, a silent cameo in every step. The inspector approves the batch with the solemnity of a scribe approving a scroll. The yeast choir hums along inside the clay dot as you pour. The light catches tiny bubbles rising in the receiving jars. They're quiet now, fewer than yesterday, but still present. The smallest punctuation marks in the text of the beer. You listen, and hear that faraway rain sound again. The heads of the jars are covered with clean cloths, tied with twine, then tucked beneath a reed mat. Shade, airflow, calm, three ingredients that don't get measured in baskets, but matter just as much. Mainstream anchor point number 2, folded in like a gentle stir. Scenes from both Egypt and its neighbors show people sipping beer through straws or ladles, sometimes with strainers on the ends to avoid the grit. You handle a bundle of reed straws with tiny woven socks on their tips, and they make perfect sense. Drink the good part, leave the sediment. The brewer lets you try one with yesterday's finished jar. You take a careful pull and find the beer soft, bready, a little tart, and impossibly comforting like warm bread learned to swim. Asterisk, you circle back to a jar that looks a touch unruly foam. Peeking again around the edges, a confetti of husks afloat. You skim once more, slower this time, letting the strainer rest on the surface so the bubbles gather themselves like guests finding their cloaks. The brewer nods. "Kind hands," he says. You didn't know hands could be kind to a beverage, but apparently, here they can. Another debate phrase drifts in on the warm air. Historians still argue whether Egyptian beer was primarily emmer-based or barley-dominant at different times, and whether mixed grain batches were a matter of taste, economy, or seasonal luck. Today's batch is emmer-forward because that's what the field gave, and your tongue is happy to be historically flexible. By midday, the courtyard quiets to a satisfied hush. Rows of newly strained jars rest like well-fed crocodiles, calm, heavy-lidded, and not currently interested in you. You prefer your crocodiles like your deadlines, distant and sleepy. The last of the cloths are rinsed at the jar where the water spout drips into a shallow basin, then draped over a line to dry stiff in the sun. You lift one. It crackles between your fingers, a badge of honest work. Someone passes a basket of onion flatbread and a dish of fig paste. You take a bite and realize you've started unconsciously chewing in time with the slow drip from a cloth into a jar. The day trains your senses to the cadence of liquid through linen drip, pause, drip like a very mellow metronome. You look. Around and see it everywhere. The bend of a reed, the check of a jar's level, the tilt of a funnel, all tiny acts of attention repeating until they become a kind of shared breathing. Asterisk. A final jar resists. Its cloth clogged from an overzealous pour. You switch to a finer, newer piece sun-bleached, natron-washed, proud of itself, and the flow resumes, thin and steady. You think of the sleeping bread set aside yesterday, waking now in slow motion inside the jars, and of the first light water you didn't catch but can almost taste in the myth. Brewing in this place is equal parts practice and poetry, and the poetry is allowed to wear work clothes. When it's done, you rinse your hands in a bowl scented faintly with coriander. The brewer presses a palm to the nearest jar, feeling you suspect for a kind of heartbeat you can't yet sense. Soon, he says, and for once it isn't tomorrow, it's later today, when neighbors will arrive with mugs and the story to trade for a pour. You step back, leaving the jars to settle into their own thoughts. The cat stretches, approves your day with a yawn, and relocates to a stripe of sun that looks exactly the size of a small cat. You take the hint and find your own square of shade. In front of you, hazy gold rests in clay, clearer with every breath. The beer has gone from bustle to murmur, and so pleasantly. Have you? Asterisk. The afternoon drapes itself lazily over the village, the heat softening into something almost gentle, and with it comes the moment everyone has been quietly expecting. First shared mugs of the fresh beer. You're invited into a shaded alcove off the courtyard, where wide clay cups are already arranged on a reed mat. Their rims are uneven from years of use, and you can see faint ring marks from countless mornings like this. The brewer's assistant moves with deliberate care, lifting one jar at a time and tipping it toward a waiting cup. The liquid flows in, a pale, hazy ribbon, the surface rippling with a faint cream of tiny bubbles. There's no dramatic foam crown. Egyptian beer is subtler than that, but there is a quiet fizz, the sort of sound that suggests the drink is alive in a friendly way. You take your cup, its surface cool against your palm, and lift it toward your nose. The scent is unmistakable now. Warm grain, soft fruit from the dates, a whisper of coriander, and that faint tart edge that tells you fermentation has done its work. The first sip is thicker than modern beer, more like a smooth, drinkable porridge. It spreads across your tongue with a gentle sweetness, then fades into a grainy tang that makes you want another sip almost immediately. Mainstream fact woven in. Ancient Egyptian beer was often unfiltered at the point of drinking, meaning it retained its yeast and grain solids rich in nutrients, and probably the reason it was such a staple of the diet. Your cup, however, has been well strained, making it less chewy and more sippable for a languid afternoon. Asterisk around you, the sharing begins in earnest. Neighbors drift in, fishers, bakers, field workers, children who've been hanging around all day in anticipation. There's no toasting ceremony here, no clinking of cups. Just nods, murmurs, and the occasional soft laugh as the beer makes its way around. A boy perches beside you with his own mug, his legs swinging idly as he drinks. He grins when he catches you watching and says, "Good bread makes good beer." You suspect this is one of those truths nobody bothers to argue about. Quirky tidbit. One older man dips his cup in honey before filling it, swirling the beer to pick up the sweetness. He tells you this is his festival style, even when there's no festival, a habit his wife calls extravagant and he calls medicinal. The brewer rolls his eyes but lets him have his honeyed version anyway. The conversation flows as slowly as the beer. Someone tells a story about a neighbor who once tried to brew using barley from a merchant ship and ended up with a drink so strong it sent him to bed for 2 days. Another recalls a batch ruined when a cat fell asleep in the warm mash. No one's entirely sure whether the cat or the beer came out worse. You take another sip and feel it settle into you. A soft warmth that starts in your chest and seems to spread outward in ripples. It's not the dizzying buzz of modern spirits, but a steadying calm. as if your body recognizes this as food before it thinks of it as drink. Historians still argue whether mornings began with beer for everyone or only for certain classes of workers, but here it's clearly a shared affair. Children sip weaker versions, elders add herbs they claim aid digestion, and workers take their fill before returning to the day's tasks. Asterisk as you drink. You notice the light shifting, spilling into the alcove in dusty beams. The color matches the beer so perfectly that you half expect the two to merge if you hold your cup just right. Outside, you hear the muffled clatter of tools being put away, goats being herded back toward their pens, and the slow hush of the village settling. The brewer tops up your cup without asking, and you find you don't want to refuse. The second serving feels even smoother, the grain flavors deeper now that your tongue has adjusted. You let it linger in your mouth before swallowing, savoring the way it fills not just your hunger, but some quieter, less tangible need connection perhaps, or simply the reassurance of being part of something practiced for centuries without interruption. A breeze stirs the linen hanging in the doorway, carrying the faint smell of river water and baked bread from the ovens. The brewer catches your gaze and tilts his cup slightly in a gesture that could mean cheers or simply, isn't this nice? You return it, deciding either meaning works just fine, and as the last of the sunlight leans across the courtyard, you understand, this is not just a drink, but a rhythm. Bread becomes beer, beer becomes morning fuel, and the cycle folds in on itself again, as steady and essential as the Nile's own slow heartbeat. The courtyard has begun to empty, but your cup is far from the last to be filled today. A faint sound of bells drifts through the air, small bronze ones, bright in tone but soft in volume, and heads turn toward the temple road. You follow the others, still sipping, to see a short procession winding its way from the painted gates. At the front walks a priest in crisp white linen, his shaven head gleaming in the low light. Behind him, two acolytes carry trays piled with offerings, small flatbreads shaped like lotus blossoms, bowls of honey, and yes, 2 large jugs of beer, their clay sides etched with symbols you recognize from temple walls. The smell reaches you before the jugs do, richer and more perfumed than the village batch, with something floral folded into the grainy sweetness. Mainstream fact, slipped in like a reed into a mat. Beer was a standard offering to many Egyptian gods, especially Hathor and Osiris. Hathor, goddess of joy, music, and love, was sometimes even called the mistress of drunkenness. You glance at the beer jugs and suspect she might take that title literally. The procession pauses at the brewery courtyard, and the priest exchanges a few words with the head brewer. There's a brief inspection, more ceremonial than practical, and then the jugs are lifted again, carried toward the temple where painted columns catch the last light of day. The rest of you follow, not in solemn silence, but in that gentle, murmuring way people do when walking toward something both ordinary and special. Inside the temple, the air cools against your skin. Incense curls up from small clay burners, mingling with the scent of baked bread and beer. The floor under your feet is smooth stone, cool enough to make you aware of the heat you've carried in from outside. The offering table is set low, covered in reed mats, and the beer jugs are placed at its center. One acolyte tips a small amount into a shallow dish, sets it before the carved image of the god, and murmurs something you can't quite catch. Then, in a gesture that seems both practical and generous, the rest is poured into smaller cups and passed among those gathered. You take one. The temple beer is different, denser, silkier, with a faint floral note that clings to your palate. Someone whispers that it's been brewed with blue lotus petals, an addition reserved for special ceremonies. Historians still argue whether this was for flavor, aroma, or some mild dreamy effect. You take another sip, trying to decide, but the beer's calm insistence on simply being pleasant makes analysis feel like missing the point. Quirky tidbit. One elderly woman claims the gods prefer beer that has heard music during fermentation. She insists this batch was kept in the temple's inner courtyard, so it could listen to the harpists practicing. Whether the gods appreciated the harp is unknown, but the beer certainly hums along nicely in your cup. The sharing here is slower than in the village. People sip, then fall quiet for a moment, their eyes on the statues or the painted walls. The light shifts as the sun outside lowers further, painting the chamber in honey and shadow. You catch sight of a mural showing a long-ago harvest, the sheaves of wheat nearly identical to the ones you carried yesterday. It's a reminder, the work you've been part of is the same work honored here, unchanged by centuries. When your cup is empty, it's refilled without fuss. A priest walks past, touching each shoulder in thanks, and you notice how even the children are quieter here, their usual giggles replaced by the occasional whisper. The temple hums with that particular kind of stillness that's not about absence of sound, but about everything present having agreed to stay gentle. Outside, the sky is bruising into evening colors, deep blue pooling above the palms. The procession disperses as naturally as it formed, people peeling away toward home or back to the brewery for one last jar's worth before nightfall. You take the slow walk back with the brewer, the taste of Blue Lotus still lingering like a pleasant echo. The jars in the courtyard wait patiently in their rows. Tomorrow some will go to the fields, some to the fishermen, some back to the temple. Tonight, though, the beer belongs to the people who made it, and the gods seem willing to share. Festival days don't arrive so much as roll in like a warm tide. You wake to the sound of drums thudding from somewhere by the river and the higher, silvery chatter of sistrums, those U-shaped rattles that make sunlight happen even when the sky is still rubbing sleep from its eyes. The courtyard you thought was busy yesterday is now a small city. Extra ovens have been stoked. Reed mats cover the ground in new squares, and rows of wide-bellied jars stand ready like a regiment of terracotta hippos drafted for service. And, paid in bubbles, you're handed a reed tally cord with small knots tied along its length. Batches, the brewer says, tapping the first knot. We count with our fingers and with these. By noon, you'll wish for more fingers. You loop the cord around your wrist and try to look like a person who understands terracotta logistics. Beer for a festival means scale double loads of emmer, double trays of beer bread, double the paddles, and triple the opinions. The bakers arrive earlier than the sun this time, their conical molds lined up like little mountains waiting for eruptions. Remember the blessing by the dot? Today the dot stamps work overtime. Every loaf gets a quick tap so the temple accountants can match offerings to batches. One stamp cracks and is ceremonially retired to a place of honor near the cat supervisor, who accepts the responsibility with a yawn and a slow blink. Asterisk, you fall into the rhythm you've learned. Crumble, soak, stir. But now each station runs in parallel. A team at the far end crushes dates with wooden pestles, thick syrup stringing from bowl to bowl in glossy threads. Another group toasts a pan of coriander seeds, rolling them lightly so they perfume the courtyard without turning bitter. The scent rises and folds into the warm bread smell until the whole space feels like a bakery dreaming it's a garden. Mainstream fact, tucked into the bustle, large religious and civic festivals in Egypt weren't stingy with beer. Texts and festival reliefs point to generous rations distributed to crowds. Beer alongside bread, onions, and sometimes roasted meats, because celebration here is a matter of feeding both belly and spirit. You see this truth walking around on two legs, porters jogging past with shoulder yokes, kids carrying miniature cups like they have very serious jobs, and a temple steward checking jar seals with the gravity of a scribe approving a royal decree. Take your place at a mixing vat with 3 other stirrers. The paddles churn in a slow clockwise dance. No one calls it that, but you feel how your bodies sink, how the liquid thickens and lightens to your motions. A drummer ambles through and taps a lazy beat that happens to match your stir speed. Whether he's following you or you're following him is a friendly mystery. Quirky tidbit. One of the old brewers claims clockwise stirring pleases Hathor and counterclockwise pleases Knum. So on festival days they alternate each hour to avoid divine jealousy. Everyone laughs, but they alternate anyway, because why risk offending a ram-headed creator god over stir etiquette? Asterisk jokes arrive as reliably as jugs. Don't drop a sandal in the vat again, someone calls to a man who clearly did once. He lifts his feet with exaggerated care, and the courtyard snickers. A child parades by with a reed crown and announces herself mistress of the foam, deputized to carry skimmed froth to the kitchen for porridge. You salute her. She lets you live. Historians still argue whether Blue Lotus regularly infused festival brews or remained a temple luxury. Today, baskets of the petals appear like a surprise guest star. The head brewer divides them with fairness. That borders on geometry, one petal to every third vat, and mutters that too much turns the beer perfumed in a way that makes bakers talk about their feelings. You file that risk under interesting but manageable. The Nile sends a breeze, and with it the reed boats start to arrive. Musicians hop off, cradling harps with curved spines and long-necked lutes, polished to a patient shine. They set up in a shaded corner, testing strings that hum against the jar's low fizz music pairing with fermentation, like a duet rehearsed for centuries. A singer warms up on syllables that taste like honey when they pass your ears. She lifts a cup, sips, and grins. Good bread, she says. You've heard that before, and it still lands like a benediction. Asterisk by mid-morning, the tally chord is 3. Knots lighter. Porters load finished mash into fermentation jars, while others cap yesterday's jars with woven lids for transport. You help tie fiber cords around jar necks, tugging each knot so it sits like a firm handshake. A boy asks if he can ride a jar to the temple. You suggest he negotiate that with a jar first. He tries jumps on the lid, wobbles, then laughs himself off. The cat looks mildly scandalized at the lack of dignity. A steward from the temple checks in with a wax tablet. 20 jars for the processional rest stops, 12 for the singers, 8 for the dancers, and the big one for the courtyard fountain. Fountain? You blink. He means a perfumed basin where beer will be ladled during the feast. No marble spouts, just a broad bowl that knows how to be generous. The logistics tick like a water clock. Stones to weight jars in the boat, fresh cloths. To keep out dust, little cups stacked like nested shells. You break for a mouthful of onion bread and a fig. The courtyard air tastes of coriander and baked clay. Over by the ovens, a new batch of beer bread crackles every fissure a future pathway for yeast. You remember the sleeping bread from earlier days. Today some pieces are dried on racks above the ovens, becoming light as pumice. When you lift one, it feels like a promise that'll wake in a jar later. Slowly, thoughtfully, a small debate erupts near the spice bowls. Fenugreek or no fenugreek for the procession beer. One brewer insists it adds a pleasing green note. Another claims it makes the beer taste like a thoughtful onion. Historians still argue over the prevalence of specific herbs in everyday versus ceremonial brews, and apparently so do brewers in real time. The compromise, 1 in 4 jars gets the fenugreek pinch. You label them with a tiny reed knot so the dancers who have strong opinions can choose their destiny. By noon, the drums outside thicken into real music. You help carry the first wave of jars to the riverbank, where boats shimmy against the reeds like excited fish. The loading is a careful shuffle. Stone weights first, jars next, then mats to stop chafing. A porter jokes that if any jar falls overboard, the crocodiles will finally open a brewery. You decide not to submit that business plan. Back in the courtyard, a fresh set of vats is already in motion. Your arms ache in a friendly way, the honest soreness of having participated in something large and uninterested in shortcuts. A woman presses a cool cloth to your neck scented faintly with lotus. For festival work, she says, and you feel momentarily like a human jar being properly kept and stored. Asterisk mainstream anchor. For the record keepers in your brain, beer at festivals often served as wages in kind for extra hand sling a drum, carry a jar, dance in the procession, and drink your pay. You watch a pair of dancers limbering up between sips, their ankle bells whispering. One tells you beer oils the joints. You are happily oiled. The afternoon slides golden. You stir in counterclockwise hour, not because you believe in divine jealousy, you might, but because it gives your shoulders a new path to travel. The paddles draw arcs, the mash sighs, and your breath falls into step with it. When a drummer raps the rim of a vat to tease out a quicker beat, the brewer wags a finger. Patience. The gods like their beer thoughtful. The drummer salutes. With 2 sticks joke number 3, and the courtyard chuckles. A runner returns from the temple, cheeks bright. The fountain is singing, he says, meaning the ladles move without pause, and the sistrums keep time. He adds, the Blue Lotus jars are popular with the harpists, which sounds like a developing genre of music you'd subscribe to. As shadows lengthen, you tie the last knot on your tally cord. The courtyard, though still busy, feels like an exhale. Jars stand everywhere under mats, beside ovens cooling to dusky red, lined along walls where lizards rest in warm commas. The cat supervisor takes a victory lap atop the reed screens, collecting admiration as a service fee. Asterisk you rinse your hands in a bowl scented with coriander and natron, and the water swirls away cloudy and honest. Around you the festivals. Hum deepens a village becoming an orchestra. Your part in it has been to lift, to stir, to count, to trust that grain and river and time know their steps. They do. They always have. And when a musician strolls past and trades you a song for a sip, you realize that's the economy working at its best. Craft for craft, breath for breath, the day rounding out like a jar filled to the shoulder room. Left for a little foam, and for tomorrow. Asterisk, the festival's music drifts into the evening, but not everyone is swept away by the sistrums and drums. In the shadow of the granary, you notice another line forming, this one quieter, less dressed for celebration, more purposeful. It's the workers' queue, and at the end of it stands the head brewer with a ladle and a long bench of clay mugs. This is beer as wages, the daily contract written not on papyrus, but in liquid gold. You take a place along the side, watching as each worker steps forward. Stonecutters with their arms dusted white from the quarries, fishermen still smelling faintly of the Nile, field laborers with lines of dust drawn across their foreheads. They hand over a small token, a shaped bead, a carved chip of limestone, a knotted cord, something that proves their day's work. In return, the brewer dips his ladle into a large jar and pours with a precision that suggests both fairness and habit. Mainstream fact folded. In wages and beer were common throughout Egypt's history, with rations recorded in temple accounts and workers' village ledgers. A skilled laborer might earn several liters per day, while those in heavy construction like the crews at Giza earned more, alongside bread and onions. You watch the transaction happen here with no rush and no haggling. The measure is trusted. The ladle is the law. The mugs are nothing ornate, simple clay, some chipped, most stained with years of beer-darkened rings. Each is rinsed quickly in a bowl between uses, the water tossed onto a patch of thirsty reeds behind the bench. Even in the low light, you can see a shimmer of grain dust settling in the rinse bowl, a ghost of all the work it represents. Quirky tidbit. One man flips his mug upside down before handing it to the brewer. When you ask why, he says it's to chase away yesterday's troubles. Whether this is a personal superstition or something he picked up from an older generation, you can't tell, but you notice he's not the only one doing it. As the line moves forward, the air fills with low conversation. Some compare the day's labor. Others talk about the next flood season, or the price of fish, or the latest blessings from the bakers. A small boy, clearly a runner for one of the workshops, arrives breathless, clutching a carved token. His mug is almost as big as his head, but he accepts it solemnly and drinks in small, careful sips. The brewer doesn't charge him for the foam that clings to his upper lip. Historians still argue whether these beer wages were intended to be consumed immediately or taken home for the family. Here, you see both. Some workers sit on low stools near the granary, drinking with the ease of those unwinding. Others pour their ration into stoppered jars to carry away, cradling them like treasure. The taste, when you're offered a sip from a mason's mug, is different from the temple or festival brews, plainer, less sweet, no coriander or lotus. It's beer in its most direct form: bread, water, yeast, and thyme, and yet it's no less satisfying. In fact, the absence of spices lets the grain itself hum more clearly, a melody you've tasted in every step of the process since the field. The brewer's rhythm is steady ladle, pour, rinse next. The cat supervisor sits nearby, eyes half closed, perhaps counting mugs or perhaps just listening to the murmur of human voices. The brewer occasionally pauses to stretch his shoulders or trade a joke with someone he knows well. Once, he gestures toward a jar and mutters, "This one's for tomorrow's crew, if the dancers don't find it first." You notice a young woman in a linen apron making notes on a small wooden board covered in plaster. She scratches tally marks with a reed. Stylus dipped in black ink, recording every ladle given out. Her concentration is intense, though she occasionally hides a smile when someone makes a particularly bad pun. The board is smudged from her palm, a living record of the day's labor and reward. When the last token is exchanged, the brewer rinses his ladle thoroughly, shakes off the water, and sets it across the jar's rim like a guard at rest. The mugs are stacked to dry, the rinse bowl emptied onto the reeds one final time. Workers drift away in twos and threes, their voices fading into the deeper sounds of the night, the lowing of cattle, the distant thump of a drum from the festival. Grounds, the whisper of river water against the banks. You're left with the quiet sense that this, too, is celebration, just one without music or garlands. It's the kind of joy that comes from knowing the day's work is done. The stomach is filled, and the evening holds no more demands. The brewer catches your eye as he ties a cloth over the jar's mouth. "Same time tomorrow," he says simply. And you realize that in this place, the calendar is kept not by dates, but by the steady measure of grain and beer, given and received in trust. The day is winding down now, the festival songs softening into distant echoes. You follow the brewer back toward the ovens, where the heat has faded to a gentle embered glow. The shadows here are long and quiet, broken only by the flicker of orange in the fire's heart. Someone has set a clay pot beside the coals, its lid rattling faintly as the heat releases the last of the day's aromas: bread, spice, and the sweet ghost of dates. You settle on a low stool, the packed earth beneath. You still warm from the sun. Around you, the last few jars of beer for the day are being covered with mats and tucked into corners like children being put to bed. The brewer lowers himself onto another stool with the slow satisfaction of someone whose work is complete, at least until sunrise. He doesn't speak at first, just rests his elbows on his knees and gazes at the fire as if waiting for it to tell him something. The cat supervisor reappears, of course, padding silently between you and curling into a half-moon shape near the embers. Its purr blends with the faint crackle of firewood, and you find yourself matching your breathing to both mainstream fact, tucked in like a final grain into the mill. Archaeological digs at workers' villages like Deir el Medina have found hearths just like this, with ash deposits showing years of steady, controlled fires, likely for both baking and brewing. Sitting here, the connection feels immediate, unbroken. The brewer finally speaks, voice low. The beer sleeps now. We will too. He tips a small cup toward you, its contents warm, not from fermentation, but from sitting close to the fire. The sip is mellow, the edges rounded, as if the beer has decided that after a long day, it will stop trying to impress and just be itself. Quirky tidbit: a few brewers like to finish their beer by setting jars near the embers overnight, letting the warmth coax out a richer, breadier tone. Some swear it helps in the cooler months. Others just like the smell it leaves in the courtyard come morning. The light from the fire paints the inside of the oven mouth in shades of copper and gold. Above it, the sky has deepened into violet, the first stars pricking through like cautious messengers. A faint breeze slides past, carrying with it a thread of the Nile's night scent, cool, slightly metallic, tinged with the hush of reeds swaying in water. You can't see but can somehow hear. Historians still argue whether brewing was ever truly separate from daily life in places like this, or whether, as it seems tonight, it simply was daily life woven into every rhythm, from the rising of the sun to the closing of the jars. You sip again and decide the argument isn't worth winning. The brewer stretches, stands, and checks the last few covered jars with the quiet pride of someone counting sleeping children. "No more tonight," he says, almost to himself. Then, he nods to you, a gesture that feels like an invitation to linger or to leave. As you wish, the embers pulse softly, and you can hear the faint pop of a reed burning itself to ash. Someone hums far off, maybe carrying the last of the festival tune back to their house. The cat sighs in its sleep. You take in one last breath of warm bread, faint spice, and cooling earth. The jars are quiet, the courtyard emptying, the stars leaning in a little closer. You've walked the whole cycle from field to grindstone, from oven to vat, from foam to cup. And now, like the beer itself, you're ready to rest. The brewer pours one last cup, sets it beside you, and walks away toward the darkened street. The fire sighs again, settling lower. You drink slowly. The taste is steady and familiar now as the beat of your own heart. Wind-downed night deepens, and the world here grows quieter with every breath. The coals in the oven fade from orange to a slow velvety red, like the last note of a lullaby. The jars rest in their corners, lids tied, holding within them the gentle murmur of yeast finishing its quiet work. The air is still, save for the soft rustle of palm leaves above and the occasional plop of a fish in the unseen Nile. You feel the day folding in on itself, wheat and water, bread and beer, hands and voices closing like a well-used reed mat. The cat shifts in its sleep, curling tighter, and even the fire seems content to let go of its last warmth dot. Your shoulders are loose now, your breathing slow. Each sound soft footsteps on packed earth. A night bird calling from the reeds feels like it arrives from far away, gentle and unhurried. You let them drift past you, like the Nile carrying small boats downstream. The stars are full now, crowding the sky with quiet light. You imagine the same sky watched over this village thousands of nights ago, and the thought is both comforting and small, like being part of a song you don't need to finish to know how it goes. Somewhere, someone hums. Again, the notes low and round. You close your eyes, still tasting the warm breadiness of the beer, still feeling the faint heat of the fire on your skin. Everything here is steady. Everything here will be here tomorrow. And with that thought, you let yourself drift. Word count: 1,105, 309 wind down.